This Equipment World video is brought to you by Chevron Delo 600 ADF Ultra Low Ash Diesel Engine Oil. It's time to kick some ash. Hi everybody, welcome back to Equipment World. You're watching The Dirt, the video podcast that's geared towards giving you discussions and news based around new construction equipment and just general happenings in the industry. Today we're going to be talking about an extremely important topic when it comes to maintaining your fleet of equipment, and it's selecting lubricants based on your operating conditions. I'm not even fully sure what exactly that means because I'm not an expert on this, which is why I've called in Sean Whitaker from Chevron, who specializes in heavy diesel engine lubricants. But before we get into that, I want to take a second to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Chevron Lubricants. Protecting your diesel engine and its exhaust aftertreatment system has traditionally been seen as an either-or proposition when it comes to choosing the engine oil that's going to protect your system. And that's exactly why Chevron spent more than a decade of R&D work developing a no-compromise formulation. Now, I don't have to tell you why a clogged DPF is bad news, but here's the real kick in the pants. 90% of that ash clogging up your DPF and then upping your fuel and maintenance costs, it comes from your engine oil. You might be thinking, why don't they make an engine oil with less ash in it then? You'll be happy to learn that Chevron agrees with you. They've developed a new ultra-low ash diesel engine oil that is specifically designed to combat DPF ash clogging. Delo 600 ADF with OmniMax technology cuts sulfate ash by 60%, radically reducing the rate of DPF clogging and extending the DPF service life by 2.5 times. Before you had to choose between protecting your engine or your aftertreatment system. Now you don't. Delo 600 ADF with OmniMax technology. It's time to kick some ash. Well, Sean, I appreciate you being on the show. Appreciate you taking some time out of your day to be on The Dirt with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. So as we talked about in the introduction, we're talking about lubricants today, primarily heavy diesel engine oil. And my first question is, when it comes to oils, as an uncultured swine, what is the difference between different types of oils other than the weight? I'm familiar with viscosity, but outside of that, what difference is there between oils?
Well, I think there's several things to unpack, but I like to start with the basics. And since you brought it up, viscosity grade's kind of the first and foremost consideration when selecting an engine oil. And viscosity grades are defined by the Society of Automotive Engineers. The SAE J300 is a viscosity classification system that defines the viscosity grade of an engine oil. And real simply, there's two numbers. The first number represents the low temperature properties of the engine oil, and the second number represents the viscosity at operating temperature. Oftentimes, the most critical consideration is that first number because it really dictates to what extent you can use that oil in colder climates. By far, in the construction industry, the most common viscosity grade is 15W40, and that 15 defines that low temperature performance, which means that the oil is capable of allowing the engine to start and for that oil to be able to be pumped through the engine at sort of minus 20 to minus 25 degrees C. If you're operating in an environment that routinely gets colder, or if it's unpredictable, you don't know if a piece of equipment might be traveling to a colder environment. And this is obviously a consideration as we start heading into the fall and winter time. It may be a good point in time to think about a lower viscosity oil, a 10W or 5W, which gives 5 to 10 degrees more robustness at those lower operating temperatures.
So what are differences now when you start, like I have no idea what is oil naturally made out of versus what is a synthetic, and what's the purpose of blending the two? How does that kind of play into it?
So there's two main kind of components to an engine oil. It's the base oil, which represents about 75 to maybe 80% of the fluid. And those can be conventional, like you say. Those are mineral derived. Those are things that we make originally from crude oil that gets refined and further processed to be kind of functional in terms of its use as an engine oil. And it's actually the same way that we make things like gasoline and diesel fuel, but just a little bit different kind of slice of the crude oil that we use to put it in engine oil. A synthetic base oil, on the other hand, is kind of purposely built, usually from smaller molecules in a very specific process to kind of build up to a chemical makeup that lends itself very well to the use of an engine oil. Some of the advantages with synthetic engine oils is that they have very good, they call viscosity index, which means that they maintain fluidity across a very broad temperature range. They're also inherently more oxidatively stable, which helps prevent from breakdown as well as from loss by volatility. So evaporation of the engine oil is generally better with a synthetic engine oil compared to a conventional.
So why would you blend the two?
Oftentimes, if we're kind of targeting performance areas, maybe like as a 10W30 is a prime example of where probably don't need to go all the way to a full synthetic base oil, but there are kind of characteristics of synthetics that help get you performance at those sort of newer viscosity grades like 1030s, give you some of the benefits of the synthetic, but at very attractive price point associated with conventional fluids. The other 25% of the engine oil is what we call the additive package. And the additive package is really the workhorse, and it has two main functions. One is to protect the engine, right? So there are things like anti-wear componentry, there's deposit control additives, there's antioxidants, all these things that help to allow the oil to perform as it's intended and help us meet these very demanding specifications. But then there's other things that actually help protect the oil itself, right? It enhances oil life and allows them to be used for a long period of time, even at the very hot operating environment that it withstands within the engine.
See, I had no idea that much stuff went into engine oil. I just thought it was something that we pump out of the ground, we filter it a little bit, and there you go, off to the races. So this is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, the real magic is in that other 25% because it's a really delicate balance of these components. So it's the things that we need to have in there, but there's other things that we only can use to a certain extent. And that's become kind of a more significant consideration now that most diesel engines have after treatment systems. So they have emission control systems that can be sensitive to some of the types of components that we like to utilize in engine oils. And as engine oil is consumed, some of it ends up in the exhaust stream and then can accumulate on these emission control devices. And so there are limits in today's specifications which say how much things of ash and sulfur and phosphorus that we can utilize in lubricating oils compared to what the requirements were 10 or 15 years ago.
And I would assume then that 25% is where you really start to differentiate yourself from your competitors, and that's where everyone is doing all of their secret sauce.
Yeah, so it's really making best use of those additives and in the right combinations, but it's very much putting it together with the base oil sort of so that they can work in harmony, because you can't really do either one in isolation. And here at Chevron, we're an integrated manufacturer, so we make base oils. We have a division that does additive development, and then of course we develop and market finished lubricants. And so that's a real advantage of ours, that we can bring all of that together in one house and provide products that meet and exceed prevailing specifications.
So I know we've kind of said we're going to talk about strictly engine oils for the most part, but I did want to kind of sidestep for a second on the topic of changing fluids for different operating conditions. What other lubricants would you consider changing as conditions change?
So I think a lot of the same considerations that apply to engine oils. I mean, looking at the operating climate, maybe even the specification of the lubricant that is required applies to other things like hydraulic fluids and transmission fluids and brake fluids, other things within the system, all need to be accounted for in terms of their performance and kind of the operating environment that it dictates.
Going back to engine lubricants now, what are the primary benefits of selecting a specific lubricant for your operating conditions? Versus going with just a generic, okay, here's the 15W40, I've used it for years, we'll just throw that in all of our equipment and call it good?
Clearly, understanding the operating climate is the most key consideration in terms of selecting a viscosity grade. So as we talked earlier, anything that is going to routinely see say, lower temperature operation, or if you have equipment that routinely shuts down at night and you need it to turn back on really quickly in a cold morning, that's where you may want to consider a lower viscosity engine oil, a 10W or 5W product. The other real key consideration, and we didn't really touch on it earlier, is sort of the specification requirements. So there's a system that's developed by the American Petroleum Institute, the API, and oftentimes if you look on a drum label or on a product bottle, you'll see the API donut. And within the donut, that defines what the credentials of the engine oil are. And for diesel engine oils, we operate with what's called the C categories. And so the most recent C category that was developed is called API CK4. That was first introduced back in 2016 for use in modern, low emission, high performing newer equipment. Engine oils that are developed for passenger car, mainly for gasoline powered engines, operate under what's called the S classes. So the most recent category in the API system is SP. You can, and we certainly do have products that meet both sets of credentials. And in the construction world, that can be a real key advantage to have a product that carries those dual claims. We call them, sometimes refer to them as universal oils. They can be used in diesel equipment, but they've also been formulated to meet the prevailing standards that allow them to be used in gasoline engine oils. A lot of times, smaller sites don't want to have multiple products, and so they'll select a universal oil that can be used in all of their equipment.
So would you be able to use one of those universal oils in some of the newer equipment with the really stringent emissions packages, or is that something, you guys are the sponsor of this show and we advertise your Dello formulation. How does that play into it? And is that something that you would be able to go between a gasoline engine and a diesel engine?
It really comes down to making sure that you pick an oil that has that dual classification, something that meets the C category and the S category. And we have a significant number of products that have been formulated to meet that. We've also, and since you brought up, we've also recently developed a product that is kind of brings some unique advantages to newer diesel engines that have after treatment systems. And so we've developed a novel product that's called Dello 600 ADF. It has ultra low ash technology. And it has about 60% less of that ash forming constituent. So that additive package has been totally rebalanced. And it's got, instead of having 1% sulfated ash, it has about 0.4%. And what we've seen is that translates into some big benefits to operators who have these newer pieces of equipment that have these diesel particulate filters, which over time accumulate with lubricant-derived ash. It's the metallic componentry that we utilize in engine oils for that additive package. And these systems work really well. They trap the particulate matter and they burn it off periodically, but there's an incombustible portion of that exhaust flow that can't burn off, right? So it's an ash, just like if you burned a fire and there's some portion left at the bottom of the fireplace that didn't burn off and go out the stack. The same thing is true in a DPF. And so the less of that ash you have in the oil, the less that accumulates over time in the system. It helps reduce your maintenance costs, and we've also found that it translates into a fuel economy benefit because the engines have to actually work harder when that system starts to become clogged with that ash, and so they're burning more fuel to push that exhaust out the system. And by keeping the system clean, you actually retain the fuel economy like when the engine was new.
Interesting. So that's an aspect. Now that you've said it aloud, I go, oh, duh, that's one of those things. But that is something that we struggle with all the time, is you plugging the filter. In fact, if most contractors aren't aware, or if some contractors aren't aware, a DPF filter, it is a filter. It is physically filtering out the ash from the exhaust stream. And that's why you have to do a regenerative cycle, is it is burning off as much soot as it can. And over time that does clog up, and you eventually have to replace your DPF, which is really expensive. And so these formulations can actually extend the overall life of the DPF. It's not just a temporary, you'll get a little performance boost. You're physically extending the life of the filter by using a formulation that's geared towards it.
In some situations, we've seen it take DPF maintenance totally out of the equation, right? Because
Wow.
and so that's one of the things that we found. And even though I'd say when we first set out to develop this product, it was really geared towards truck engines and thinking about when those first started using DPFs back in 2007. But the off-highway market, construction, mining has been a very attractive place for these ultra-low ash lubricants because downtime is very expensive. Oftentimes, you're far away from the maintenance facility, right? You can schedule things like oil changes and other maintenance events, but if you've got a light that goes off and says you need to do DPF maintenance, you got to shut the system down. You got to, allow it to cool. These systems, because of the way they operate, the exhaust
Extremely
system itself
hot.
can get hot. So
Yeah.
you may have to wait a day just to be cool enough that you can handle it, remove it, and then do that DPF maintenance one way or the other. Sometimes it's a replacement for, a clean part. Maybe it's if you've invested in the equipment to blow it out. But either way, it takes time and money, right? And so that's one of the things that's a real advantage of these newer lubricants is that it allows for that maintenance interval to be as long as possible. And that's on top of those fuel economy advantages that we talked about.
Now I guess I get to my question, and this is really going to show my ignorance. How extreme of a conditions change warrants doing a lubricant change? I mean, obviously, we're not talking about doing weekly changes because the weather drops from 90 degrees to running in the 70s. So as a contractor, when do I really need to start thinking about, okay, we're moving into a different season, we need to do some lubricant changes?
Well, so weather's clearly one of those considerations, but the other kind of angle that I think is important here that we really haven't touched on is even looking at the specific type of equipment that you have. That can dictate the type of fluids that are recommended, and that does change over time. There are certain manufacturers that lean exclusively on the API system, and so like I mentioned, an API CK4 may be perfectly suitable, for a broad variety of equipment. But there are manufacturers that have very specific OEM specifications, and so if a fleet is taking in new hardware, maybe moving from one OEM builder to another, might be a good time to kind of revisit your oil selection and make sure that the products that you're using meet the prevailing standards. May even be an opportunity for you to take advantage of higher quality oils that offer longer oil change intervals. There are certain manufacturers, even in the off-highway space, that do have kind of tiered recommendations depending on your duty cycle, but also the oil quality. So they may have different specification tiers that enable you to go to longer oil change intervals by choosing a higher quality product.
And so this is where I have a question, just as the old car guy in me that is set in my ways that you should change your oil every 3,000 to 4,000 miles. So when you start getting into these longer life oils, it is okay to go the duration that the oil says that it is good for. That's not something that I should have to continuously worry about, that I was always taught 3,000 miles, 3,000 miles.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I would say, rarely the case for passenger cars these days. I mean, they'll have much longer recommendations, or in a lot of cases, they have oil condition monitors now that tell you exactly when to change it based upon your operating, behaviors and so forth. For construction equipment and other off-highway pieces of equipment, I would say for a long time, the nominal change interval and most of that kind of equipment is geared in hours instead of miles. But the pretty typical change interval is like 250 hours. We're seeing that get longer and longer, and that's for a variety of reasons. So 500, maybe even 1,000-hour oil drain intervals are clearly achievable now for certain types of equipment if you're kind of in the right duty cycle, and a lot of times that's defined by how much fuel you burn. Some types of equipment have different size oil sumps, so you might be able to get a bigger sump that allows you to achieve a longer drain interval recommendation. And then, of course, there have been just changes overall to engines themselves. They've got electronic controls and high pressure injection systems and good temperature management, robust materials, all these things that they've been working on for a long time to help keep maintenance intervals where customers want them to be, which most typically is, longer is better than shorter.
So let me ask you this. If I'm a contractor that has traditionally done the 250-hour oil changes, as you've done, like my 3,000-mile example, that's just ingrained in you. But I finally decided that now I want to realistically come up with an oil or a lubricant change schedule for my company. How do I go about determining what hourly intervals I need to change fluids? Is that a test I have to perform on the lubricant? Do I go off of the bottle or the barrel of the lubricant? What's the procedure there?
So oftentimes the first thing I recommend is open up the owner's manual, right? So get in contact with the engine builder or the equipment builder. And oftentimes what I find is that people don't even realize that the recommended interval is much longer than maybe what their common practice is, right? So that's the sort of the starting point. At least get out to where the engine builder recommends. Like I said, that a lot of times that's getting well beyond 250 hours these days. But it may also define some other things that you need to do to qualify that. That might be different or more filtration. It may be using a higher quality lubricant. It may be limiting idle time. I know there's all kinds of factors that can define it. Another thing to do is talk with your oil supplier, right? So one of the things that we often do when we're consulting with customers who want to do this, or maybe even that are nervous in going to those longer intervals that the OEM recommends, is setting up an oil sampling program. Right? So it's a relatively routine service. It's something where you can take samples of the engine oil over time and have them analyzed and evaluated to kind of determine, whether it would be in fact appropriate to go out much longer. And oftentimes in off-highway equipment, I think that there's a lot of room for extension. I think we've been fairly conservative over the years in that space, and oil's gotten a lot better, and I think OEMs have gotten a lot smarter about how to develop products to keep oil lasting longer in the system.
So my final question, and this kind of segues into it. I've decided I'm going to do a lubricant swap. I don't want my old, whatever generic Walmart brand lubricant anymore. We're going to go with the nice premium stuff because I want to boost my hours out there. Do I need to do a full system flush in order to do that? Or is it something where just a typical standard oil change where drain the old stuff, change the filter, fill it back up?
So in general, engine oils themselves are usually compatible with one another, but clearly the best practice would be to get rid of as much of the old oil as you can. So if you're talking about on the piece of equipment itself, that means do a complete oil change. So that's oil and filter or filters, as is often the case in bigger pieces of equipment. That ensures that you've gotten all of the old oil out that you can. I mean, I don't think it's necessary in most cases to do anything more extreme, like sucking it out of the overhead or dropping the pan. But taking those kinds of measures with the equipment itself, and then if you've got like a bulk tank, similar kind of considerations apply. Wait till that tank is at least down to the suction tube, and before filling up with the new oil. That's kind of the best way to go about it. But and there's really typically not anything more extreme that is clearly necessary during that transition period.
Perfect. That's simple enough. I think I can handle it. So that's all I've got for questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you feel would be valuable to the contractors watching?
This is the right time of year to be thinking about seasonal changes. You don't want to be kind of waiting till it's too late to kind of revisit what's right for your operation, maybe in the winter time, or maybe, even just the way things have been, maybe slower for the past 18 months or so here around the world. I mean, as things are picking back up and, maybe get ready for the change in seasons. Talk to your oil supplier about, maybe different ways to kind of maximize the savings. There's a lot of things that you may not think about in terms of the way the oil can help improve your operation. It's not just about protecting the engine itself. I mean, even though that's first and foremost the function of the lubricant, but there may be ways to enhance fuel economy performance by using a lower viscosity engine oil. And then we talked about some of these unique advantages of the ultra low ash engine oils, because those are providing benefits to systems that weren't used in construction equipment 20 years ago. But I think as operators are getting more familiar with those systems and some of the trouble that they have with them on occasion, I think there's a lot of things you can do to stack the deck in your favor by choosing a high quality lubricant.
Well, thank you for all the information, Sean. This has been super educational. Like I said, I came into this not knowing anything about engine oils, and I feel at least a little dangerous now. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. I love the topic, and hope you and your viewers did as well.
And on that note, I think we can put a tidy bow on this one. Sean did a phenomenal job of breaking that down into terms, which, by the way, Sean is an actual scientist that actually helps develop the formulations they use at Chevron. So for us to be able to understand a single word of what he just said is a testament to Sean's ability to dumb it down for the layman. I'm talking about myself here. I really appreciate Sean and Chevron taking their time to come on the show today to explain this topic to us. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them down below and we'll do our best to get them answered. And we'll catch you guys on the next episode of The Dirt.